Hey, welcome to another video in my series of craftsman kits in HO scale. This time the company is Fos Scale Models. I believe it's called Fos, not FOS. And the kit is Hollis Pest Control. So let's see what's in the box. There's the corrugated sheet metal made out of paper. That's good. I liked the paper. Bunch of sticks, some cardboard, wood paneling, I'm not sure how big this building is, but it looked like a really interesting building, so thought I would give it a try. As usual with these laser cut wood kits, the first thing you want to do is read all of the instructions. Make sure you understand them. I never seem to do that, but it's always good advice. Instructions for this kit are actually kind of sparse compared to some kits. But that doesn't necessarily mean anything bad. We have 2 pages here of instructions. And then we have this sheet, which is our bracing pattern, and the wall plan. So it looks like an interesting wall plan. So it says the first thing that you have to do is brace all of the pieces, and so I will get started on that. I've started putting the bracing on. One of the nice things about this kit is they actually color code the strips. So you have a color coding here of the different sizes, so it makes it easy to figure out which size it is. But there's one part that's confusing. On this diagram, we have red and green, and the red is an 1/8 inch and the green is a 1/16 inch. And I thought that the green was supposed to go on the back of the thing, but the green is the corner decorative part. What do they call that? It's the corner trim. So it actually goes on the end. So I had started gluing them on the back before I figured out that I made a mistake, and was fortunately able to cut off the ones that I did. But that was a little point of confusion there for a second. I'm in the process of painting the walls, and the kit comes with some pretty detailed instructions on how to paint the walls. And for them, the first step is to use a wash of India ink. And I've never done that before. It seemed like an interesting idea, but I think I'll save it for another time. So what I've done with these is I've sprayed them with a gray enamel. This is the shade of the gray, really. I sprayed with a gray enamel, and the main reason for that was to seal the wood so that the acrylics don't warp the wood. And then I did some airbrushing of a couple different shades of gray, 2 different shades of gray. The dominant one is this sort of golden color or brown color. And then I sprayed everything with Tester's Dull Coat Lacquer, again in an attempt to prevent the acrylics from warping the wood. So the next thing I'm going to do is a wash of this gray, slate gray from Americana. Now I'm going to apply what would be the actual paint color for the building, and for that I'm going to use Wicker White from Folk Art, and I'm going to apply it with a sponge. I'm getting ready to apply the accent color, and my accent color is Folk Art Skyline. I've masked off the pieces, and in some cases I was very careful to mark what section of the piece is going to get the paint. I really don't want to mess up and have to repaint a piece. I figured out that the correct distance that I'm using is 7 of these narrow clapboard slots and 4 of the wider clapboard slots. There are 2 ways you could have done this. The way I did it is I put white everywhere, and then I'm going to put the blue over top of the white, the idea being that the blue paint went on top of the white paint. You also could have excluded this area and not done the white, but of course it's easier to not mask off when you're doing the white and just do the white everywhere and then do the blue over top of it. So like that, you can still see the white through there. So it looks as if the blue paint, the idea is that the blue paint has worn off, revealing the white paint underneath. And then these are my corner trim pieces, and the way I'm going to paint my building, I'm going to make these blue as well. They did theirs white. So in this case I'm just doing blue over brown. I have my walls painted and I pulled off all the masking tape, and this is the result. This is the foundation piece, and I went around and numbered where the pieces go. The next step is to take the corner trim and add it to the various parts along the side like that. And that is these green pieces in this diagram. The next step is to do the doors and windows, and they provide plastic doors and windows. I started by priming the doors and windows with a brown enamel from a spray can, and then I used a sponge and some washes to add some more browns to it, so that's where we are at this point. I'm going to paint them blue to match the blue around the base of the building. The sample that they built, they painted the doors and windows white, but I thought I would go with blue. So I'm just going to use a sponge. I thought that the blue went on a little heavy in some areas, so I'm just going to come back with brown and just hit it very lightly. When you're using a sponge, a lot of times the raised areas will get much more coverage, and that's not necessarily what you want, so sometimes come back and hit it with brown to give it more of a chipped paint look. That looks pretty good for now. I think I'm going to give these a brown wash and then attach the panes, and then they get attached to the building. I've assembled all the windows. For the walls, I gave them a wash of brown. It was a pretty light wash, and then I put on some weathering powders, and then I sprayed with an acrylic sealer to seal in the weathering powders. And so this is the result. And then reading along in the instructions, I found that there is a sign that needs to go onto wall 12. This is wall 12. So I'm going to cut out the sign and apply wall 12. I wish I had done this before I put the weathering powders on, but I think I can still make it work. Here's my completed wall with the sign attached and the weathering powders added over the sign, so it's ready for windows. I've started the process of attaching the walls, and there's this one area that is a little bit confusing in the instructions, and that is this R6 roof panel, which is supposed to go 1/8 of an inch down from the top of the walls. Now, I accommodated for that in the diagram. Here, 1/8 of an inch, but the diagram makes it so that 1/8 of an inch down is for the bottom of the panel. It looks like he built his so that 1/8 of an inch down was the top of the panel. Although, in the end, I don't know that it even makes any difference. I think it's just, you're supposed to make it a little bit lower from the top of the roof. So we'll see what happens in the end. I have the walls mostly assembled. There's still a little bit of brazing that I need to do. It was mostly straightforward, except this one area was a little bit confusing with this bracing and this piece number 2, but it went together pretty well. I have pieces for the tool shed, which are 2 pieces of cardboard, which you cover with strips that are scale 1/8. So you paint and weather those as you want. The next thing I need to do is add scale 2x6s around the tops of the walls, like around here in front. And before I do that, I'm going to have to paint them, because these are going to be the blue trim color. So I got to find all of these pieces and paint them the same way I painted the other blue pieces. I've assembled and painted my loading dock. For the paint, I started out with burnt umber, and one of the advantages of using this sort of poor quality craft paint is it almost goes on like a stain because the coverage is so bad, so it actually looks pretty good. After that, I gave it a very heavy wash of the appropriately named barnwood, and then once that had dried, I gave it a wash of Vallejo black wash, specifically the wash. And this is the result, and I'm pretty happy with that. A lot of modelers, and myself included, make the mistake of painting aged wood brown, and it's really black and gray. And I think that this is a pretty decent black and gray color. So I'm going to leave that the way it is for the most part. On the building, there is this angled piece, which goes on here. You have to sand down the edges to give them an angle. So it goes in this position. I painted the walls black just on the inside, so that when you look inside, it's just totally black. You don't see the inside of the walls. And my next step is to attach these trim pieces, which I have painted brown and then gray, and then used a sponge to put the blue on. So I'm going to get started on that. Turns out the easiest way to attach these strips is to just glue them on and then trim off the excess with flat nippers. There is no diagram as to where they go. You just put them on wherever you think it's appropriate, apparently. I'm preparing tar paper for the roof, and the technique that I'm choosing to use is one that Jason Jensen did in one of his videos. You start with black construction paper. Mine I had already cut into 1 centimeter wide strips, but you could do a solid sheet, and you spray paint it solid with a gray enamel out of a spray can, and then you lightly spray flat black over top of that. So if you look really close, you can see the gray through the black here. It's kind of a speckled appearance. If you start with a solid sheet, then you want to cut it into strips afterwards, obviously. So I have a paint stick here from Lowe's, and what I'm going to do is start sanding off the color. Here I have a 400 grit Tamiya sanding sponge, and I started with this, but 400 grit I think is too fine to really get the effect that I was looking for, but you could use it if you like the effect. So I have a 220 grit piece of sandpaper, and I'm wrapping the sandpaper around the sponge like this because I like the curvature that I get with the sponge, but the sponge is too fine. 220 grit works well. And then I just start sanding off bits of the paper. As you sand, you go through the black paint to get to the gray paint. You go through the gray paint and you get to the black paper. So that's the effect that we're looking for. As you move closer to the edge of the stick, the edge of the paper frays more. Like that. And then if you want to fray it even more, you can use an X-Acto knife with a rounded blade like this one and just scrape on the edge of the paper. Like that. Here's a number of strips that I've done already. The next step will be to attach them to the roof, and then there'll be further weathering after that. I've started painting the corrugated sheet metal. I started by cutting them into strips of the correct length, and then I spray painted them with a dark brown, a red brown enamel color, which is really this color. And then over that I sprayed a somewhat light coat or medium level coat of Tester's graphite metallic gray, which is kind of the metallic color that I use for these. So now I'm going to rust them using a sponge and craft paints. So I'm going to blend the paints. I have the 3 different colors in the palette here, and I'm going to start with the darker color. Here are my roof panels with the tar paper applied. After I applied the tar paper, I applied some weathering powders, and I never like to leave weathering powders just laying on the model, because if you touch it you'll get fingerprints or whatever. I sprayed it with an acrylic sealer. I didn't like the way that looked, and it toned down the weathering powders a little too much. So I put on more weathering powders, and this time I tried spraying it with a Tester's dull coat. It still toned down the weathering powders a little bit. It muted the gray, so I think it looks a little more monotone than it did before I put on the weathering powders and the sealers. Also, the process of putting on the tar paper caused the cardboard to bend a little bit, to warp a little bit. So I've added some braces to straighten out the cardboard before I tried to attach it to the roof, and I think that helped. Had to be very careful that the braces don't interfere with any of the other braces that are already in here. So now I'm ready to attach these roofing panels, and then this panel goes in here, and it's the one that gets covered with the sheet metal. These are my sheet metal strips, and the acrylic is dried. Now I'm going to use the AK Interactive Dark Rust, and this is an enamel. I used a chopper to chop the sheet into equal widths. 3/8 of an inch in this case is what they recommend. And so I'm just using white glue to glue them to the roof. And this is what I have so far. I wish I had made them a little tiny bit longer. It would have been easier to get 2 exact rows onto the roof. I'm still going to have to put some kind of a cap or something on top of that, but this is what the result is at the moment. As for the edges, I'm going to come back and fix those once all of the panels have been applied. I'll do some additional weathering and fix up any mistakes. This is how the sheet metal roof looks after I've applied all the sheet metal panels. I need to touch up the edges of the paper where you can see the color of the paper, and also along this rim where I had to fold the paper to get it over the cap. That's what I decided to use for the cap. I'm working on some final details, and that includes the signs. I kind of forgot about them at the time I was painting the walls. I could have attached them to the walls before I did the weathering, but I didn't think about it. Typically with a kit like this, before I do anything with the signs, I like to scan a copy into my computer to save them in case something goes wrong. And before you do that, it's a good idea to mark dimensions on the side of the paper. So in this case, like inch hash marks. And that way, when you reprint the signs, it makes it easier to scale them to the right size. So some of these signs don't really go well just glued to the walls. Like these here. These signs don't really go well glued to the walls. So what I've done is I've glued them to some very thin sheet plastic. I'm not sure what size it is, but I think it's 020 or thinner. And I glued them using spray adhesive. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to weather the signs just attached as they are using weathering powders, and then I'm going to spray with some Tester's Dull Coat. And after that, I can cut off the signs. And the idea here is you're sort of imitating the signs being metal rather than paper that's attached to the wood or painted onto the wood. Another thing that you can do once you have scanned is you could print these out as decals, and I haven't quite gotten my printer to work with decal paper yet, but that's something that's on the list of things for me to work through and figure out. So once I get that working, I think the preferred thing to do would be to print it on decal paper and then attach it to the plastic as a decal and then weather the sign. Here are my signs after weathering powders and then spraying with Tester's Dull Coat. I think the weathering powders are a little intense. One way you can minimize that is to spray the paper with Tester's Dull Coat or an acrylic sealer, something to seal it before you put the weathering powders on, because I think just the exposed paper sucks in the powders much more than it would if there was some kind of a sealer. So the next step is to cut it off the plastic. And by the way, I painted the back kind of a rust color just to give it some kind of a background to start with. So I'm going to cut a sign off the plastic. So this is the result. So all I have to do is paint the edges, and it's good. I think this is a little bit thick, so I think next time I'll try it with even thinner plastic if I can, or maybe even just a very thin piece of paper. Previously I did a video on how to do corrugated sheet metal using a paper product from Northeastern, and it was on a Bar Mills kit. So I thought it would be interesting to compare the results from that method to this method. The steps were about 50% the same and 50% different. So here we're looking at the two different types. So you can evaluate for yourself which technique you like. If you like the other technique, then go and check out that video. I think they both look interesting. We're always doing that balance between what looks cool and what looks realistic, and it's not necessarily always the same thing. One of the last things that I like to do on a build is add a little bit of green slime around the base of the building. In this case, I'm going to be using this Vallejo product, but this just simulates sort of the moss and lichen that it accumulates in humid environments, and I just put it around the base and on like some of the wood. I did like this kit, and it wasn't particularly difficult to build, but there were some flaws that will certainly show up in the close-ups. If you don't get the wall straight, it gets hard to get the trim straight, and if you don't get the trim straight, it gets hard to get the roof on tight everywhere. And so I have some fairly significant gaps between the roof and the walls in some places that are quite obvious when you look at the close-ups. Other than that, it's a pretty interesting building. I definitely recommend it. I think watching this video will help you build it. I do have a couple criticisms of the kit. One is that he actually does not include the card, the backing card for the sign that goes on the roof. It just seems like that's something that should be included. He just says to use scrap card. Another is that in the sample build that's in the picture, he has some window blinds in the windows. It's just kind of a pet peeve of mine that they put features in the sample build that they don't actually include in the kit. I understand the trucks and the figures and all that's to make a scene, but if it's actually part of the building, it seems to me that it should be included with the kit. And so I guess I understand why they don't include necessarily everything. You know, these are just small companies trying to put a kit out there. And, you know, most of us who are building these things have lots of spare pieces and stuff sitting around. It would just be nice if they're not going to include it in the kit, they shouldn't put it in the sample build, but that's just my opinion. That said, I'm still going to do more from Fos Scale Models, and I have another kit waiting to be built, and that will be part of a video.